all of you at the Glass Art Society Conference, the 50th anniversary here in Tacoma. They kept us apart last year, they couldn't do it again. And so this is reclaiming glass in sustainability in principle and practice. So I'm going to give you kind of an overview of glass art in the time of climate change, where the environmental movement stands as a whole, and how we as the glass community fit into that. And then I'm going to move on into demos of using bottom glass on the torch. So as Heather said, I'm not the most average person. I've been traveling around the world for the past 7 years and loving every single moment of it, but of course, the tipping stones to finally becoming not a normal human forevermore came when my parents decided to go on an adventure and travel through the Appalachian Trail from Georgia to Maine, 1,724.9 miles from Mount Springer, Georgia to Mount Katahdin in Maine. And it may be why I'll never be normal, but it proved that you can do anything when you put your mind to it, and the truth has been the same throughout my entire life. So I love nature. I grew up outside, I grew up exploring, and absolutely loved every bit of that. But I didn't catch the glass bug until I was in my teenage years. On a family trip while being homeschooled, we went out to the Corning Museum of Glass. We expected to spend, half a day in a glass museum. Who could spend more than half a day in a glass museum? And then, of course, it took the entire 2 days that we had allotted in that region, and I've never looked back. I ended up at Rochester Institute of Technology, where I have my Bachelor of Fine Arts. Yeah! RIT represent! And so I have my Bachelor of Fine Arts in glass and glass sculpture, and then I've continued to travel from there on out. But as much as I delved into the world of glass, I couldn't leave my environmental roots behind, and so I instead continued to just lay that love of the environment out into my artwork. And so I started all the way back in sophomore year making works about plastics in the ocean, which was an issue only just starting to be talked about at the time. Subjects of habitat loss and endangered species rife throughout. And that all culminated really bringing my love of both glass and environment together as the artist in residence in 2019 for Denali National Park. But when we talk about glass art in the time of climate change, when we say climate change, when we say global warming, or even more traditionally global bearding now, when we talk about that, of course, that brings to mind images of calving glaciers, that brings to mind images of rising sea levels and everything else. And we talk again and again about individual choice, consumer habits, and the power of the dollar, but we also, of course, have to recognize that it's not individual action alone that can make a difference. When we talk about the environmental movement, we have to talk about the fact that, of course, 70% of the pollution worldwide comes from 100 companies alone. And so it's by using our collective voices to collectively pressure those different companies to actually start making a difference. And I'm not here to argue with you about whether or not climate change is a thing. I think as a whole, as a community, the glass community is pretty groovy. We're all pretty sure that climate change is a thing. And so we know that the earth is warming. We know that it's becoming warmer every single year, and the consequences of that are becoming more and more apparent as we go on. We're already starting to have extreme weather events and other things as we warm. And as we warm up more rapidly, our earth that we inhabit can't adapt fast enough in order to withstand all of those changes. And so as we watch that, we want to make sure that we're preserving not only the earth that we love. I'm not a doom and gloom naturalist, environmental educator. The earth is not dying, but the balance that we enjoy, the things that we enjoy from earth, are absolutely in jeopardy. And so I want to make sure that we're talking about all of that, from the preservation of rainforests to our oceans and everything else. We think about bleaching corals, about melting ice, but we have to really stop and think why these things matter as a whole. Is it simply because we don't have glaciers, or because glaciers hold 70% of the fresh water on our planet? Is that the true value of that ice? And so when we look at that, we really have no choice but to come to a very easy conclusion, and that's that we need to do something, that something needs to give, something that needs to change. And whenever we decide that that's not maybe what we want to do, it comes up to a really good point. Well, what if it's all a hoax? And we make all these changes, we put in all this energy and investment, and we make a better world for nothing. That's what's at jeopardy if we do nothing, is simply that all this energy that we put in is for something else. So when we talk about graphs and charts of when the sixth extinction, we're talking about rising sea level change, we're talking about things like overshoot days where we use up the Earth's resources sustainably before July every year. It can make a really big difference. So we want to make sure we break down all of these different things very easily. And so we need to take it from industry to something a little bit smaller, something that we understand a little bit better. And so really what we have to see is we have to zoom in from this macro perspective of the environmental movement and instead think about where art fits in. Because it's not just glass art, but all kinds of different art. Even something as far-flung from us feeling today as Africa has impacts on how we think about environmentalism in art. So elephants, of course, are the native source of ivory. And the first time elephants almost went extinct was not because we hunted them for our meat, not because we hunted them for their habitat, but instead because our love of music drove their ivory to such high prices that we almost wiped out an entire species specifically because we thought piano music was so spectacular. And so we nearly took out a keystone species, altering an ecosystem entirely before we understood what we might have needed from it to put it back. And then we follow that ivory into the places it was being used, into church organs and piano concert halls and others, and we start to see its relation to how we were also working as our own industry in those things. Things like stained glass moving into cathedrals. Of course, we have these cathedrals themselves are an environmental impact on the landscapes around them. We know Notre Dame doesn't look like this right now. Instead, that roof collapsed back in 2020. And when that happened, when it collapsed, there was a lot of debate about how it would be rebuilt. How would we put back this monument that meant so much to the world as a whole? And it's not about the money in this case, about how we would do it. We raised billions of dollars in a few days. But instead, we had to talk about it to the point where were we going to source the timber for Notre Dame? Because the beams alone would take 1,000 oak trees over 150 years in age in order to restore it to its grandeur that it had been. And we deforested Europe in the time of cathedrals. We don't have those forests to source from anymore. And not only that, but oak trees don't reproduce quickly. It takes 50 years for an oak tree to produce its first 10,000 acorns, one of which will become an oak tree. So as we want to restore, as we want to create more art, we have to think about the impact on the things that we're going to be sourcing from our now more limited resources. And so as we think about that, we get to move fully into glass. As an industry, as an art, we're a much shorter history. And so we quickly go from making small glazes on ceramics, small amulets and beads, moving into the time of the glass blower. Moving from a time where we have so few glass relics, because most things, if they broke in that day and age, just went right back in the furnace to be something else. And so instead, it's not until we get to the time where glass was ubiquitous, glass was luxury, glass was everyday, glass was the way of the world, do we actually start to see glass waste, because there was a person or multiple people behind every single bit of glass, hundreds of thousands of pounds of wood, of mining resources and other things, so that glass was so much more valuable than we consider it today. And so of course the island of Murano, as it created so much glass, started to work within their restrictions to make sure that they were creating actually what was pretty environmentally friendly glass of the day, specifically environmentally friendly because they were being taxed so heavily by the Italian government. When your glass is costing you the materials of the weight coming in, the materials of the weight being shipped back out, you suddenly become a lot more environmentally conscious unintentionally as you're trying to evade taxes as you go along. And so they had very, very little glass waste, as it turns out. And instead, only those hand ornaments, those small practice objects would have been the things left behind or wasted and not put back into the furnace time and time again. But of course, we have more glass than that. Glass is what has allowed us to expand to the point of the society we enjoy today. And so when we think about those things, we see the bottle. The bottle starts to become completely ubiquitous, but we go through glass as an everyday object of almost no consequence until we think about it. From the windows that line our houses, from the space shuttle windows, the telescopes of Galileo, glass has been what has allowed us to do everything in our history. It's so incredibly valuable until we no longer attribute that value to it. And so that's where we need to come back in as the glass community and start to reattribute that value we love so much, not just on new glass, but on old glass, on waste glass as it was, to make sure that we can. And so that's what we're going to look to do. We're going to look back to things like the bottle machine, the first time when people were no longer directly involved in the creation of every single drinking vessel, of every single transportation vessel, of all of our mediums. We're going to look back on that and say, hang on. Did we mean to do this exactly the way we did? Because when the Owens bottle machine was created in 1903, it was the first time that we really saw glass become so ubiquitous that it would be piled, smashed, and shattered in every different form around the world. And so when we start to see that, we have to consider the overall context of what that led to next. Because it wasn't just to an excessive waste glass, but instead, it led to something else. It led to this idea that the thing that your product came in was no longer valuable. And what that led the way to was plastics. Now, plastics is something that I talk a lot about in my work as an environmental educator, because if I had a soapbox moment, it would be this one. It's that I don't care what your plastic says on the packaging. Plastic is not biodegradable. Instead, it photodegrades. We go through millions of tons of plastic every single year, and every single bit of plastic we have ever produced still exists on our planet in one form or another. And for the most part, it's not existing any longer as large, discarded pieces of plastic. Instead, it's breaking down. It doesn't biodegrade, it doesn't go back into the natural order of things. Instead, it photodegrades, breaking down in the sunlight until we have microplastics. And microplastics are so small that they cannot be seen to the human eye, but as we look through our world, we find microplastics everywhere. At the top of the Pyrenees Mountains in France, the bottom of the Blue Hole in Belize, we find them in placenta. We now find them in every sample of human blood that we take in a study that just came out now in 2022. Microplastics are a problem we had no idea we were getting ourselves into, but it leads us to a question of how much should we really be creating and wasting of this product that we've created, of this plastic, because it's led things like the Great Pacific Gyre, the Great Garbage Patch, twice the size of Texas. Most of that is microplastics. And of course that has its own impacts on the environment, whether that's entanglement, ingestion, or contamination of those places that we love. When we look at a beach strewn with plastic, we look at a beach that is trashed. But when we look at a beach that is strewn with glass, instead what you have is a tourist attraction, a thing of beauty that glistens, and something that's not impacting the local flora and fauna and economy. And so even when things are waste, the value of that waste is extremely different, and glass value waste is much, much higher. So as we look at things, we have to talk about where does our glass go when we're done using it, whether that's the break-off bucket from the hot shop, whether that's the applesauce jar out of your refrigerator. And so there's a lot of places that that glass absolutely goes. Unfortunately, sometimes that's the landfill, which is never where the glass should end up. A glass bottle might take 1 million years in order to break back down into sand, but if we take it and we start doing some of that processing, we can much more quickly use that glass again. And so instead we look to industry. They should be doing the brunt of the heavy lifting when it comes to actually recycling our glass, and in some cases they are. There are some really good examples of industry stepping up and taking charge. One of those incredible examples is actually Owens Corning. They take immense amounts of glass every year, but they're not making it back into glass proper again, not taking container glass and making containers, but instead taking their glass, using technology to sort it by contaminant and color, and then using it to boil down in furnaces powered entirely by wind in order to make something that makes our buildings even more sustainably, environmentally friendly time and again. Taking that glass and instead of melting it down fully into glass again, pouring that glass and whipping it like cotton candy in order to make insulation. The better insulated that houses are, the more likely they are to be energy efficient. They need less heating and cooling in the long run. So instead we look to that as a fantastic example of industry stepping in, but there need to be more of them. And next, if we're not making insulation, if we're not making new glass out of recycled glass, what are we making? The answer is sand. Sand is a huge problem in our world right now. It's the most commonly purchased item that we don't think about. We use it in construction, in building foundations. We use it for homes, playpens, for coastal restoration. We buy sand but the sand has to come from somewhere. And when we mine sand, we're taking it from ecosystems that should have that sand. So instead, we need to think about what can we do with that. And again, there are incredible now grassroots movements instead of industries stepping in to fill this problem, to answer this need. There's an incredible industry down in New Orleans. I don't know if any of you have seen Francesca on TikTok or heard of Glass Half Full, but what they've done is recognize that their city sent all of their glass to the landfill. They didn't actually recycle any of it. So instead, a couple college students starting in their backyard decided to take this problem and have to date diverted 2.2 million pounds of glass from their local landfills. They realized very quickly that it was too cost prohibitive to send their glass further out of New Orleans, and so instead they decided to stop at the crushing stage to keep their glass recycling to the point of sand, and taking that sand to use it for very important causes. New Orleans is a place that is below sea level and sinking still more quickly, a place that is constantly in threat of hurricanes and other natural disasters. And so they realized that with all this glass that they had and with all this sand that they were producing, it needed to stay exactly where it was. And so they've taken this incredible mountain of glass that they've taken in and turned out incredible amounts of sand for both coastal restoration and for sandbags for natural disaster relief. An incredible example of using what you need in your area and making it adaptable to your local circumstances. Because we don't need anyone doing sustainability 100% perfectly. We need 7 billion people doing it imperfectly and having local adaptations, global awareness of the problems that we're facing, and local action and innovation in order to address those problems. And so we have hot shops, of course, too. This is both industry and grassroots, but what about us, the glass community? There are already incredible examples. Places like Zaquiche down in Oaxaca, Mexico, working entirely on recaptured methane, as well as recycled glass, continually perfecting their operation to be environmentally friendly. New Guinea in Swaziland, another incredible example. And then, of course, we're here doing this. The sustainability panel that happens annually at the Glass Art Society conference, allowing us to come together and share both our research, our experiences, and our passion for being environmentally friendly, is going to make all that difference. It's incredibly important. The other thing that's really important to recognize when we talk about environmental concerns and environmental problems is that we have success stories. It's really easy for me to be that person at the party that brings the mood from here to here when we talk about environmental concerns. And when I do that, I always feel bad, but it's important to recognize that just as easily we can point to the things that are successful. And so when we look at that, my favorite example of conservation success is the story of humpback whales. Megaptera novanguli, the long arm of New England. This type of whale was once hunted to the point where there were only 2,000 individuals left in the Pacific Basin. We took them down to the point of almost genetic collapse. But then something else happened. Humans, being the very strange species that we are all or nothing. And we made the decision to do the Save the Whales movement, the most successful conservation campaign in history. And so we took them with the inspiration of individuals, of public outcry, and particularly of artists, in order to protect this incredible species. As we started to protect them, it was artists that led the charge by dropping hydrophones beneath the surface, learning that whales could sing, by spreading that song across the globe, illustrated depictions of an animal that there were so few of that people couldn't see, really led the charge to the point where we could talk about actually starting the process of the international moratorium on whaling. We brought their numbers from next to zero to what we now consider to be pre-exploitation numbers. And now that we have more whales, we're starting to understand what a good decision that was. Not only are they beautiful, are they majestic, do they hold a lot of intrigue, but we've learned just how important they are. They travel from their polar feeding grounds to their tropical breeding grounds, and when they do that, they are making these incredible migrations that lead to whales actually fertilizing the oceans. So I got this map from a friend at NASA, and it showed the biodiversity of the oceans. In the polar regions, we have a lot of nutrients. We have extremely wealthy oceans. In the tropics, we call them oceanic deserts. And as it turns out, whales are the leading force of bringing nutrients to those tropical areas. And when they do that, they allow for photosynthetic life to come to fruition within the ocean, specifically diatoms and zooplanktons that are responsible for 2/3 of the oxygen that we breathe here on the planet. No matter where you live, you breathe because whales poop. That's just the way that it is. And so they make this incredible thing, but without artists creating work about them, without leading that passion for preservation, we wouldn't have that today. We're also still continuing to learn that each whale is worth about 32 tons of carbon sequestration themselves. They build it into their forms and they keep it forevermore out of the atmosphere. So the more whales we have, the less warming we're going to have of our planet. It seems like a pretty win-win solution for another step, another diversified way of protecting the planet that we love. And then of course we come further away from just wildlife art to working with art of all different ways. I'm not saying that everyone has to make work that is environmentally themed, but if we all use a different facet of environmental consideration within our work, we can make a huge difference when it comes to how sustainable our community is as a whole. So I've been looking at these things since I first came into glass blowing, and my most recent work has been called Reclaiming Glass, about looking at the importance of glass from an environmental standpoint. And when the pandemic happened, I was slammed home. I was brought back to earth very rapidly from my jet-setting, traveling, environmental educating, and art creating lifestyle to being very stuck and very much isolated inland. It was extremely confusing time, and I decided to take that time to really put my money where my mouth was and start working as environmentally friendly as I could at home. And the best way to do that was by not having glass shipped to me out in New Hampshire, but instead using the glass that I already had on hand. And so I started to take bottle glass to the torch as often as I could, and I learned a lot along the way. And so things I started to create were things I already knew how to make, but using recycled glass presented its own challenges, its own foibles, and of course its own burns along the way. The piece that I'm wearing now was one of my most latest creations that I'm extremely excited about, and these are a few of the process shots. So going back to my original flame working and bead lady roots, I started working with a single wine bottle, breaking it down from the bottle that it was, and then actually making beads out of the entirety of the bottle. As soon as I had all the beads collected, I then started to crochet and weave them together into a single strand. And as I did that, I created one necklace from one wine bottle. This one piece I call the weight, because this piece not only weighs almost 2 pounds, as it is an entire wine bottle, but it's also the wine bottle from the bottle of wine I shared with my friends once we could finally get all back together the first time we were vaccinated and allowed to mingle safely. And so not only is it the weight of the glass, but it's the weight of time taking to get to that point, as well as the emotional toll the pandemic took on us all, even though some good things could eventually come out of that. And so I'm going to show you here how I make different components from recycled glass on the torch. I've been doing an entire series of goblets that are broken down wine bottles as well, and of course working in just the bottle rainbow, as I've heard it called recently, and making different elements. So for the most part, when I use all of these different components, I make sure that I'm segregating my bottles. We all know about compatibility issues, about making sure that we're not cross-contaminating, and there is some point to which you can get away with it within working with bottle glass, but for the most part, one wine bottle, one project, and you can get away with a whole lot. And so I've been popping bottles apart, reassembling them cold, and then flame working those additional details and components that I want in order to make my vision or my inspiration come to a final piece. And so every piece has a little bit of character, a little bit of difference, and of course that comes from working with the wine bottles or with the glass that you have on hand. Then when you want to get a little bit more abstracted, when you want to get away from that wine bottle, you can break it down still further. I've been making botanical elements embedded with wire and then using those to weave together forms in order to make larger or more collective pieces by assembling them cold. I don't have to worry about the compatibility later on. And so one of the things I've been doing is working with wire amateurs underneath, as well as a little bit of black strong to make sure that I can increase in scale. And so I'm going to show you here how I break down bottles to get the most out of the bottles I've been using, but also I've been working a lot with not only the environmentally friendly materials, but with those environmental themes. And so the footprints that you just saw were called How Green Is Your Footprint? I'm all about the puns. But then also starting to break down and thinking about, well, I'm here now making glass out of recycled bottles. I'm here making things about environmental art, but what's really coming next? What is it that might be my next step? And no matter how small those steps are in working towards an environmentally sustainability future, it's all steps in the right direction. Thank you. I'm going to throw just some big shards of glue to preheat into the annealer next to me. They'll come up while I work on other things. And then I have other pieces ready to go. Slide those right in there. And the best part of working with shards is if they break, it doesn't matter, they're already broken. And I'm also going to throw out my hair because, you know, safety first. Do you guys have any questions for me while I get going? Anything right off the top?
What temperature do you keep your shards?
What temperature do I heat this to? So I asked for a soft glass program in the annealer. You can get away with bottle glass with both a Boro program or a soft glass program. So bottle glass is not like working with soft glass. It's not like working with Boro. It is somewhere straight down the middle when we're working with it. And so in that consideration, you both get a lot less leeway than Boro and a lot more leeway than soft glass. And so you can kind of work out yourself what you like your annealer to do, but if you've already got a program you like, you can pretty much stick to it and that'll be just fine. Now when I break down glass bottles, I started off just smashing them, but I quickly realized that that left me with too much powder, that left me with too many tiny little sliver shards that I was never going to be able to use up. And so instead of working from big shards, I started hot popping my bottles down into different forms. And so once you get your bottle down into small cylinders or into just the top and the bottom, you can really start to work with them a lot more easily and make sure you use every single bit of the wine bottle. One of the things I will say is that when you break it down from rounds into strips, is that for some reason the way the pressures work inside of bottle making molds, the outside of the glass is much stronger than the inside of the glass. So when you're cutting up your bottle into strips, instead of using your glass score on the outside of your bottle, you're going to use it on the inside of your bottle, and it's going to break that much more effectively. The trick is that I have had way more cuts from cold glass than I have ever had from burns in hot glass. And so when you do this, make sure that you are being really careful, safety glasses always, but then I do very easy light scores, one on one side, roll it right over, one on the other, and then just a quick tap, and it pops right apart. But if you do that on the inside, it doesn't go at all. Breaking glass is always popular in the glass thing, but then you can just work scoring it down, and you very quickly just have very even shards to work with.
How did you get into that point?
How did I get it into rounds? You can either use a tile saw or just a hot pop, which you can do with a creme brulee torch. And so you just add a little score line to the side, turn it on a turntable, count to 17, hold your breath, and if that doesn't work, shock it in cold water and it pops apart. Yeah?
Did you only make one score mark on that and then just broke?
So I made a score mark on the far side and on the closed side. So one on each side to break it in half originally, and then just one score mark per slide. So just one on one side, flip it over, one on the other, and it pops right apart. It took me surprisingly long to figure out to cut it on the inside as opposed to the outside, but it works so much better. So now that we have our strips, just like a nice cooking show, we're going to go ahead and fire up our torch and break it down into cane. So I've actually just ordered a vitrograph kiln. I haven't even fired it yet, it's at home, but that'll allow me to start pulling cane to work with on the torch much more efficiently from a couple of bottles at a time. But it's important to know that you can also work straight from your torch. You don't have to have a way of pulling cane other than just on the torch is a good way to start. And by show of hands, do we have bead makers here? Yes, all right. We're gonna start with your easiest way then. Everyone's torch is a little bit different. Come on. There we go. So when I first started, I didn't have any boro. I'm an entirely soft glass. Soft glass person on the torch. Typically, I work with very little boro, and so it wasn't something I had on hand. So when I wanted to start pulling stringers, I'm going to switch from safety glasses and into didymiums. The darker the shade of your bottle glass, the darker you want your didymium. So if you've got more than one pair, you'll see when I go from working with the green to working with the blue, I'll switch to my darker didymiums just to save my eyes a little bit. But I didn't have any boro and I needed to pull cane. And so what I did was I designated 2 different mandrels, and they are my cane pulling mandrels. Next, we're not doing this any fancy. People are like, oh, well, it's so shocky. You have to, preheat it. You've got to do all these different things. No, you don't. You can just go right for it with bottle glass. So you have to be careful, and soft glass trained me that when we introduce glass to the flame, we bounce it. We bounce it far away from ourselves originally so that if it pops away from us, not towards us. If you don't work in a rolly chair, when you start working with recycled glass, you're going to want to, because the amount of times it will end up in your lap are substantial. So instead, we just bounce it just like soft glass so that we don't immediately shock it, but then we just hold it. We just hold it there. That was enough? Nope, not quite enough. That's going to happen more than once, and I'm going to break some of it on purpose. And now you won't know which ones are on purpose. But I'm going to take it and just heat up the end of my mandrel as well, tag it right there into the glass, kind of roll it in, and then start to just really get that situated on there. As soon as I can, I pull off my tweezers so that I don't have to hold it except by the mandrel. And depending on how large your workspace is, how close the next torch is next to you, is going to depend on how large a strip you want to turn into a cane. The more space you have, the bigger canes you can pull, but the smaller your space, really work kind of to your means, because if you start pulling out all the way down next to you, the people beside you are going to get mad because you're going to be in their space. So you can see how quickly this is heating up. I just heat up the other half, tag it right in, and twist. Once I have it all there, we're just going to quickly heat it up to the point. The biggest pain about bottle glass is that it's designed for mold making. It's not designed for art glass makers. It's not designed with workability in mind. Instead, it's meant to fall out of a furnace at a great rate of speed, blow up, be molten, juicy hot for a split second as it gets blown into a mold, into a shape, and then it needs to freeze instantaneously so that it can go down the conveyor line and through the annealing process. And in no time does that leave you with time to think, time to pause, and really consider the move you're about to make. When working with bottle glass, you need to work with a lot of deliberation. And so working this way, I'm just getting this nice and hot, and immediately you can see just how soft that is. And then I'm just gonna get it in even heat, and I'm gonna pull slowly for just a second, and then I'm gonna pull fast. This gives me a nice even stringer, it gives me a nice even cane. I tip my hands down right at the end because I'm going to melt one off on the torch, and then I'm going to go ahead and use my tile nippers to cut off the other side. I also work on a much smaller torch at home. I work on a Cricut, not on a Carlisle. And so even if you have a tiny torch, you can do this. So I'm just going to slide this in front of me and click off the other side. This will be cool enough to touch in just a second. And then I always have a waste glass jar right in front of me, because when it breaks off the end of the mandrels, it'll pop pretty hard, and you want that to be contained. I usually have a much larger jar, but traveling and weight restrictions and bags meant that I brought a tiny jar instead. Let's do that again in case that was too fast. You guys have any questions about that, pulling cane? The slower you pull, the thicker the cane you get for working. You pull it too fast, you get hairs, just like pulling any other stringer. But actually breaking down your bottles like this and working with your individual bottle gives you a lot of control over the pieces that you will then make out of it. I could pull it all from a vitrograph kiln, but that means I would be going into making my piece having no idea how this particular bottle behaved on the torch. And so when I do that, it's something to really consider, because I will say this, I made an entire piece of art out of Jameson bottles They broke down beautifully, they melted really easily, the color was really hard to burn out. And then I recognized that Heineken bottles were in much higher supply at my local solid waste facility, and they were about the same color, and I was like, oh, I'll just switch to Heineken bottles. That'll be really simple. And the answer is no. Don't do that, because the more expensive the alcohol inside the bottle, the nicer the glass seems to melt. They're nicer glass. This way and that. And so, even though there's still some of the waste left over on the pulling mandrel from the last one, that's okay because there's the same piece of bottle. I'm usually pretty good about knowing just by the tone of the glass which bottle I'm working with, but I don't take notes, and I should. If you're someone who takes notes, I highly encourage you to take notes while you do this, because you will quickly be like, which bottle did that pile of glass come from? I said I was going to remember, and I don't. So I always have a series of jars. I don't think anything goes to the actual recycling in my house anymore. Instead, my parents just like put jars on my working table, being like, Celia will use this for something, whether it's to melt down or whether it's for organization. It just depends on the day.
How do you clean them before you start?
How do I clean it before I start? So it's dependent on every bottle. That is one of the most annoying things of working with wine bottles is the variety in labels. The paper labels typically come off really easily just with hot water. And so if you fill your bottles with hot water and allow that heat to soak in, it compromises the adhesive and you can get it to scrape off really easily. You don't want to leave too much adhesive on. You can get away with a little bit and it will burn off, but it's toxic to breathe, and so you really want to scrub that off. For the plastic labels, I use a razor blade, and I have a couple pieces of wood on an angle in order to spread them between. So one of the things I'm doing is I'm turning the mandrels in my hand right now kind of opposite one another, like I'm wrapping it together, and that's pushing any bubbles that came from actually collapsing that piece of flat glass into a round ball. That's pushing the bubbles to the surface and allowing them to pop. Wow, this is so much faster on the Carlisle. Okay. So again, slow pull it originally, and you can see how much that moves right off the bat, and I want a thicker cane this time, so I'm really just letting gravity do it. I'm barely pulling this time. How many of you have tried using recycled glass on the torch before? Oh, a bunch of hands, fantastic. How many of you got burned? Yeah, all of us. The fact that I've only popped it once is good. I'm glad I wasn't first. I was really worried I was gonna burn this table and leave all the scorch marks, but they're already scorch marks. Now they won't know which were me. All right. So I have some canes now. I want to show you how the colors work a little bit differently. So I actually did already break down, just like a cooking show. Ta-da, it's done. Break down a bottle of another color. Also, something I wanted to show you was that the bottom of the bottles are all extremely different thicknesses and have that different amount of kick in the bottom. These pieces are under a lot of strain as they are the first thing to hit the mold when it blows up. Which means that if I were to introduce this piece directly to the flame, it would explode into 100 little pieces. And so these are basically the only ones that I never introduce directly. You can, however, get away with directly introducing the tops of the bottles because they are thin enough and are typically a little bit more even. But what you need to be really careful about if you're introducing the top of the bottle is that this is a funnel. And so if you put this in the flame, you're going to funnel your flame at an angle, whether that's out towards someone next to you or back towards your own fingers. And so you have to be super careful not to do that. You can start from either end of the bottle tops. They all have those different shoulders. And so let's work with this one. We'll just take a bit of that top. Sometimes what's nice about it is that it's a little bit more glass. It's a little bit thicker. And so you can get away with using it a little bit faster. And so I am just going to hold this in my hand. I'm not going to use the tweezers because it's a little heavy. But again, just bouncing it. And if the glass shatters on you, the tables are always of the fireproof substance anyway, and you're working with broken recycled glass. You just pick that back up. You can even, once you get it onto your mandrel to pull cane, work with it carefully enough that you can just pick things up off the marber and just quick flash them back through, and you can get away with a whole whole lot. And if you have questions while I'm looking down, just shout them out, make them loud.
Do you ever use elbow rest?
Do I ever use elbow rest? I don't. I typically work much lower with my elbows on the table, but I find that I lean on elbow rests too much, and so I don't prefer them. Usually what I do work with is a light directly over the top of my head. I find I really like to see what I'm doing. And I feel like, especially with bottle glass that glows different colors, it's harder to get used to. Having a really solid light source can be very, very helpful. And then sometimes when it's really dark and I'm basically working in my parents' kitchen right now, I use a headlamp too. It's real fashionable. I've got my didiniums, my audiobook in my headphones, and a headlamp on. Real fashion statement. So you can see here that I can just hold this up now with the mantle on the other side as I melt this down. And so if you wanted even to just reshape the bottle, if you wanted to manipulate this to a point and then put it away, you can see that I haven't cracked the rest of this yet. You could very easily make work that was just exaggerated bottle forms and flexible shapes without worrying about cracking too much of the rest of it. So now I'm just turning, there it goes. Perfect. So that's what I wanted. That is actually what I wanted to show you. So, I know it looks bad. We're used to being like, the glass broke, oh no. But what this has done has shown you where all the stress was in it. So that shoulder where it goes from the thicker glass to the thin is always good, but this also has spiderweb forms of cracking in it right now. And so I'm not gonna leave it on the flame too long because I wanna use all of this. But you can really see how that starts to change. And so working with the necks of bottles, you can build up more material. You can see that this is probably 4 of those little strips worth of glass. So if you're going for thicker canes, or you want to make a whole form just out of this and you really want to build up that material quickly, working with the neck of the bottle can be a really fast way to do that. But once you get it hot, it really moves, it really drips. So you've got to be ready for that because it's all at once and then it's all done. I find that when world workers start working with recycled glass, they don't bounce the glass enough, they don't baby it as it goes in the torch, and you're much more likely to bust it up in your space. It'll just blow up in front of you. And then I find that soft glass workers never get it quite hot enough because you're not used to building up as much heat in it as world workers are when you really need to do those big moves. And so it really makes you want to be the best of both worlds. I didn't realize that all the bad habits of bouncing boro were going to come back to my favor when I started working with this. There's one big bubble in here I'm trying to bust before I pull out my fingernails. And I'm just twisting this to make sure I don't have more bubbles before I pull this in. I find that when I work directly pulling cane, I prefer the metal mandrels to another technique I'm going to show you. But when you preheat things, like when you use the bottom of bottles or really thick shards, there are some companies that make really thick glass bottles. They're harder to introduce directly to the flame. It can be done, but it's less success rate. Then you can go ahead and actually use the kiln to heat up. That's actually still coming up, which is good. But then you can just start to see. I'm barely putting any more heat in this because this wants to be embarrassing. This wants to get away. So I'm just making a thicker cane this time, just so we can build up material faster. And also this green's a little bit darker. It's working a lot more softly than that slightly lighter green.
Did you ever consider using like a Roosterone with like doing like a big batch?
Yeah, so if I'm going to do a vitrograph pull, which I'm going to start doing when I go home, or if I used a crucible to do a really big batch, what I have planned to do is to mix more than one bottle together Glass bottles nowadays, they tend to be close to the same compatibility, but not identical. And that comes from some recycling, that comes from some of the molds needing glass that behaves in a very similar way and requiring a very similar COE. But what that also means is that you can fudge it a lot. So if you put glass together in a crucible and leave it molten together for a couple of hours and give it a good mix, make it bubble and make it mix, then you can go ahead and actually use that as its own COE, as its own batch within that color. So you can mix glasses that are close to the same in color in a crucible in order to have its own COE rather than being all those different bottle COEs. Yeah, so I always have a jar of water, a dry jar depending on how I'm working with it, and then all mandrels made up ahead of time, and then I have wire as well. Question for the audience, do you have a preference if we work on forms with wire in them? Do you want to see, I want to show you some hollow beads just because it shows the behavior of this type of glass really well, but do you guys have a preference of what you wanted to see? I love being able to talk to my audience again. Thoughts? Okay, hollow beads and on the wire. Okay. Everything. All right. The kiln is still coming up, so we're going to break down a little bit more. And I also have a tray of other beads and elements that I've made. If you want to pass that around too, you're more than welcome to look at all of that. But let's actually pull a few more canes because this is still, it's not quite up to temp yet.
Yeah, I've got a question.
Yeah, Laura.
You know the botanical forms that we're doing on the wires?
Yeah.
I've been doing some similar stuff and I find it like it's like almost looks like a vitrification when you stretch it. Have you been getting that?
Yes. So
Can you avoid it?
you can avoid it.
Okay.
So when you get vitrification or the kind of that scuzzy on the surface of your bottle glass, the blues are the worst offenders. And that comes from burning it out. So when we pull the canes out of the blue, I'll show you a little bit of it. But what it is that the scuzz is just on the surface, and it's typically mold contamination or just other dust on the surface. So wash that glass a little better before you use it. It'll have less reaction. And then also you can kind of scuzz peel off before you make your element, and that'll work much more easily. And so, I don't know, which green do we like better?
Have you ever put your glass in pickle?
Have I ever put it what?
In pickle?
I haven't put the glass in pickle. Not been something I've thought about. This is the problem with working with a little bit thicker of canes. Yeah, try to steal that tray. I won't pop any glass if you want to steal it. Yeah, so the tray that'll come around now is all recycled glass, all different types of bottles. There's some pieces on wire in there. I use a mix of either copper wire or of just stainless wire. Both work really well. The stainless wire is less messy. The copper tends to corrode. In the kiln, it has all those black flake offs and everything, so you typically have to sand down the wire before you make anything. But they both work really well. For really small elements, the copper works better because it's compatible, and so you get away with more. If you have stainless steel wire in a very small piece, it's more likely to crack. So you get away with much softer glass. Yeah, I was really intimidated by bottle glass originally at first because I'd break it off continually, because I thought I had to do all this preheating and getting the annealing schedule just right and all of that. But I've been working with some Polariscope film at home and others, and I've been practicing with my annealing schedules and everything else, and it's really forgiving because it cools so quickly, because it freezes. It doesn't have as much time for stress to get imbued into it the same way working at the furnace allows that to happen. Because you can't work it as long, you don't include as much stress, it doesn't get as finicky.
Have you ever done any enameling on it?
Have I done any enameling? I haven't done any enameling yet. It's something I'm definitely interested in because we have this limited set of colors. It would be fun to start enameling some clear glass. But because all of my work is environmentally based, the green color palette hasn't really been a hindrance to this point. I have found that I've started fusing some of the bottle glass, and that's really likely to devitrify if you have a typical fusing schedule that comes out. Score. If that comes up quickly and then cools down slowly, you'll always get devitrification across the surface. But if you crash your kiln, if you get it all the way hot and then bring it all the way back down to a kneeling point, it doesn't devitrify and you can keep that gloss. And I learned all this because I was being really careful with my annealing schedules. I was keeping notes for once. I was being really good. And then I looked at my temperature gauge on my kiln one day, and I went to wipe something off the screen, and I watched the temperature gauge do this under my finger, and realized that it wasn't the temperature it said it was inside, and that the thermocouple had failed. And so all of my careful note-taking and planning had been for naught, and so I've been eyeballing it. And it works. It's really freeing.
Celia, do you use a pin vise to hold the wire, or I don't see it?
Yeah, so do I use a pin vise to hold the wire? I would like one. No, I don't. So I have forceps, or what I use. So I was very much using what I had on hand and reinventing the wheel even when I didn't have to. I hadn't seen anyone use one of those wire holders on the torch before. And so I didn't know any better originally. And so I got really good at locking the forceps and then holding above the handle so that I could turn them more evenly. And that works really well for me. It's a little awkward at first, but it can be done. And that's one of the amazing things with working with bottle glass on the torch is that I went with a normal set of tools, with a very basic set of tools on a really small Cricut torch in my parents' kitchen. I was originally in the garage, but it got to be winter and it was so cold that I learned that at 36 degrees, even with the space heaters on in the garage, my hands shook too hard to put polka dots on beads. And so my brother and my dad for Christmas brought my entire setup inside for me. That was what they did Christmas Day, was bring my entire flame working setup inside, which was very kind of them. But now they all have to listen to my torch, and I have people hanging over my shoulders whenever I'm working, which is both entertaining and fun. Occasionally I have to scream at the top of my lungs for somebody to come take the cat, because it's scratching at me from underneath, and it's like, my hands are full. Can't do it all. Okay, so we have some things here. This kiln is almost up to temp. We can get away with the temp it is now for some wire forms. So I'm just gonna turn this down real quick. So I have just a tiny spool of copper wire that I brought at a craft store. It's not 100% copper because, of course, it's not. It's Michael's. It says 100% copper, and then when you watch how it burns, you know that it isn't. But one thing that you will notice is that your copper wire stretches when it gets warm. So cut your wires a little bit shorter than you think you're going to want to work with, because otherwise you end up wasting a lot of wire as it stretches. And so I just cut off a few different pieces. You can choose your own gauge. I think this is 22 that I'm using now. And so I brought my handy dandy forceps. I was going to get a wire holder before I came, and I was like, you know what? They should see me struggle to show that they can do it too, even with the most basic of tools.
Do you hold the copper wire in your bare hand right now?
Nope, so can't hold the copper wire in your bare hands in the flame. It's not a safe thing to do. Instead, I just have these locking forceps, so it's locked in there, but I don't put my fingers through the holes because you still need to be able to turn it. And so I'm going to choose one of these canes. I'm just going to work in the inner flame. I think it's so small. And so again, when you reintroduce this to the flame, you'll notice that it has bubbles in it, and it has some imperfections. There's going to be some cords in the glass from where there was cords in the furnace glass from the bottles. That's all fine. It's part of the organic nature of using this type of material, but it is going to mean that you need to bounce it like you would bounce soft glass. Whenever I teach soft glass classes, I teach students to bounce it away from them with an open hand so that any pop back doesn't get in your lap. And then once you bounce it a little bit, you can do a couple little test holes to see if it tinks. And then you're barely going to enter that wire. And when you put your wire in, you can see whether or not it's got a sealant on it, because you can see that all just burnt off. That's so that it stays glossy in the store without tarnishing. Burn that away. You don't need that. It's never going to stay. And then for copper wire, you need to be really careful not to get it too hot. Because copper and glass have the same coefficient of expansion, and copper has a fairly low melting point, You need to make sure that you don't ball it up and melt your wire way down to anything. So I preheat it gently until I see the very tip of it start to ball up. And then I get a gather on the end of the rod. Let that ball up. And then I'm going to apply it, all the glass I want pretty much at once. Because if you try and hold the rod in there to add more, you're going to overheat your wire. So wire hot and then just on. And it very quickly falls to the center and then just melt that away further up the rod. You can kind of wrap it around. But you can see how soft this copper wire is. It's bending as I add glass to it, which the stainless, if you were working on something larger, wouldn't do that. So I like botanical form, so that's what we're going to go with. We're just going to heat that up. My hands are shaking. You all make me nervous. Just kidding. You all seem very nice. One of my favorite things for flame workers is going around and seeing how different everyone's mashers are. There are some that were like very clearly designed for glass blowers that are very nice. And then these are the most shoddily welded pliers with sheet on them. And I have no idea where these came from. But I'm always curious. They came in some starter kit that my grandmother got me when I was 16 with a hot head. So I just flattened it real quick. And now I want to give it some leaf texture. But again, I'm not going to heat it all the way back to the wire now. Where that wire is, I want it can get a little bit glow, but not too much more. And then once you start working with this, you need to work with a lot of deliberation, a lot of intention, because your heat does not stay. And so you get it hot, and then if you want texture, do it in one. Ooh, there's wax on those. How did that happen? Surprise. And then just heating that up again, and then where that line is, turn in wax. Nobody likes waxy tweezers. All right, and then you have your little leaf. Don't forget that you're filming them; they can see it. Perfect. And then once I'm here, I put my fingers back in the forceps so that I can unlock them as I go into the annealer. And ooh, see, melted through the wire. Here we go. Oh, here it is. Yeah. So if you get it too hot, Carlisle's are hotter than the torch I have at home. You will drop it. It's not pointing. But bottle glass is so forgiving that didn't crack. Now that wire's really short. Let's do another one. You guys have any questions about that specifically?
Celia,
yeah.
Earlier you were talking about how this glass was designed to fit into a mold and cool down very quickly.
Yes.
Do you find that helps you apply like texture or patterns to this glass like you print it? Especially if it's really like solidified.
Yeah, that texture solidifies really fast. And so that can be really nice, and it's kind of that double-edged sword. If you're going for a lot of texture, you're going to be able to keep it because it doesn't want to melt in that texture. But you have to have the glass extremely hot. So any texture you want to add, you need to add almost all at once, or else getting it hot again to add more texture will melt out what you already have, because it has kind of that one moving point rather than a gradual scale of moving points. Here, I'll add a couple of lines to this so you can see what I mean. So for this one, I kind of threw it on there, and this is a thicker cane, so I can build away without getting the wire too hot, so I can get a larger form here. And then one of the tricky things about using recycled glass can be building up enough material. It can be really easy to work very small once you get working with recycled glass because of how hot it wants to be. And so instead to do that, there are a couple of things I can show you. I pulled that first stringer really thin, so it'll be a good one to show you. But there are a couple of ways where you can double up and build up so that you can work with more material with less time. Because one of the other things I'm always thinking about is like, how long am I leaving the torch running? Is this really less energy exhaustive than working with fresh glass because I can work with fresh glass faster. And so that becomes something I wonder. But when you work with different tips and tricks in it, you get really fast. So I just melted through my wire and then immediately stuck it back up, and it's fine. Carlisle, so much fun to do crickets. So now there's a piece of wire in there. I'm not gonna care. Alright, so this time I'll add a couple of lines to show you the texture. I'm gonna add them all around the edge. But I'm gonna get that pop just on that edge. And I need to get it really hot so I can get all the way around in one. Pinch. And like, I got 4 pinches in before the heat was gone. So you need to move really quickly. Which is easier when people aren't looking at you. I can add a little bit of texture without worrying about melting out what I already have. And you kind of pull it, and luckily botanical forms don't have to be exact. I used to want to make things like very scientifically accurate to all the points of the leaves, and then I realized this is an artistic interpretation. And I'm not the boss of this. So another little botanical element. We won't melt the wire on this one. Put that away. All right. So now, building up mass can be really hard with working with recycled glass. If you pull your stringers a little too thin on the torch, like this one is very thin. One of the things you can do is simply double them up. So this is called the tuning fork method because it looks a bit like a tuning fork, but you just hinge it and hold it, and then you can do that more than once to the point where you have a larger rod to work with. So you're just kind of folding it up to make a larger form, making sure never to touch either end because both are hot right now. And then when you want to, I'm just going to melt this one off the end. I'm going to pinch these all together, and I'm just going to give it one handle. So now I've gone from a really, really thin piece that would have taken a long time to melt in, a long time to build, to the point where I have a much bigger mass to work with. I learned this from Christina Logan in her bead making course. When she's making her really large disc bead, she'll actually double up a full rod of ephetrate and work with it that way so that it's much wider. But I found that when I pull things too thin, that works incredibly well. Now this kiln is up to temperature, so we can start to work with the glass as I would if I were bead making. And I'm going to break this down in half just so it's a little bit easier. And so in the stuff that's going around, you'll notice that one of the forms I make a lot of, or if you come up and look at this little goblet that's on the table, one of the forms I work with time and time again is a spiral. And the reason I use a spiral is because it's really convenient. Oh, here, Kate, I have a bowl. Bowl all set. So, thanks, Kate. And so, let's bring this torch back down to kind of a beading torch level. The spiral I work with because it's one of the easiest ways to learn how this glass is going to behave in the torch before you start making really complicated forms with it. If you can get an even, nice roll off of your rod, you're going to know that it's going to come easily when you're working on the next thing. And so, again, bouncing it in and out of the flame. I actually already pre-coated all of my mandrels, which is very unlike me. Usually I do it as I go. But because this bottle glass is stiffer, one of the things you also need to do is actually make sure that your mandrel is a little bit warmer than you would have it for soft glass. I know boro makers usually hardly ever use mandrels. I heard a boro worker once tell me to get my sticks away from their glass. I thought that was very funny. But they're helpful sometimes. But so you can see I'm just barely working up the surface of the stringer, laying it down, and it's really teaching me how this particular shade of bottle glass wants to work in the torch. It's also allowing me to pop and melt out any bubbles that I don't want that are going to add imperfections as I go around. And the more you do this, the more even your spirals will get. And so you can really start to fine tune and hone in. I make really large spirals, really small. I've been sewing with them. I've been using them cold assembled onto the gauntlets that I've been making. They started out as water ripples. They've kind of continued on as a form I've become really kind of obsessed with. And so I continually just keep making them. But now, one of the other things you have to think about when you're working with this type of glass on the torch is thinking about keeping it all hot. It's something that boral workers will struggle with when they start working with this, just because you're so used to being able to pull it out of the glass, stop, and think about it for a while. And bottle glass doesn't want you to do that. It wants you to just keep going as much as possible. And so for this, I'm going to make a hollow bead now. It's something that I make a lot of, especially with the darker shades of bottle glass. It really allows for the light to come through really nicely of the glass. And so who here's made hollow beads before? Who knows what's about to happen? Okay. So for hollow beads, I don't use a puffy mandrel. Some people prefer to use a puffy mandrel so they can inflate their hollow beads. I never have. I've just always used the 2-disc method. And so we're just going to build up discs side by side on this mandrel. It's not like that. No. There we go. And so I'm just going to build up my discs. Found an imperfection in this stringer. Hey, come on, you're making me look bad. But one of the best things about hollow beads is that they don't have to be neat to start. A lot of people make really beautiful even spirals for their hollow beads. They're perfect discs side by side. Some don't even have the texture on them anymore. I am not that precise. I've always been a much more organic or impatient glass blower, depending on how you look at it. And so they can be a lot less even, and especially because the stringers that you pull will typically be less even, it's important to remember that if you have holes or if you have unevenness in your discs, just come back and fill that in later on. It's going to be just fine. I started making hollow beads originally because I wanted to make really large fish on the torch, and I wanted them to be hollow simply so that I wasn't using so much glass. But then it meant that I didn't have to have perfect hollow beads because I was pressing them into fish shapes, and so you couldn't tell if they were even walled hollow beads to start with anyway. So let me practice a lot of them, and now I can get even hollow beads without all that stress at the beginning. So something you'll notice I'm doing is building up not one disc and then the other, but building up both pretty evenly next to each other and making sure that I always come back and flash that other disc before. So you can see that popped off when I didn't really intend it to, that's okay. I often will have one disc bust entirely and I'll start that one over if I lose control of, if I'm trying to go too big and I forgot to flash. And the best thing with recycled glass is sometimes I even just pick up the pieces of the disc off the table and put them back. That's too short. We switch. One thing to be careful about is that because it gets hot so fast all of a sudden, you have to make sure your discs are all the way touching before you start to melt in any of that texture, or else it thickens and condenses down way before you're ready for it to. So most people, when they make hollow beads, build their discs perfectly into each other. I don't. I take a metal tool, I heat up each disc, and I push them in each other until they touch. They look really bad originally, they're really lumpy, they're really uneven looking, they're really awkward, and that's all okay. Let it have character for a minute. Okay, so once you have it to this point, because this glass is so much stiffer, because you have it technically colder while you're working with it, one of the things you need to do before you round out your hollow beads is make sure you don't have any holes. And to do that, I'm going to take this glass rod and I'm just going to flash it through the flame looking for any particularly dark spots that tells me that there's a hole. And I'm just going to heat up the tip of this stringer and fill those holes in, because anywhere there's a hole is going to leak air, and then your bubble won't be able to puff up, and that's sad. Because we're working with some glass magic, with some glass chemistry here, this is not an attractive bead right now. At least I don't think so. It's really lumpy, it's really uneven, but because I've now trapped the air in there completely, so long as I get the mandrel hot, so long as it's sealed all the way over, I can go ahead and just begin to heat this. And as it heats, it will expand because the hot air trapped inside will expand, and the entire thing will round out. Ta-da. If you want, you can guide it a little bit if it needs it. Mind it where you want it to be round. And then, unlike soft glass, don't get it too hot, because if you get it all the way to that molten stage, it's going to slump all of a sudden. So as soon as it starts to feel like it's moving on you, go ahead and pull it out of the flame, take a look at it, and then you can re-puff it one more time. So, hello, Pete. Okay, so now that the kiln has been up to temperature for a second, I want to show you another method for building up mass, and particularly for working with those larger shards that you've already preheated inside the kiln. And for that, I'm going to do something that everyone says not to do, and I'm going to mix glass compatibilities. So I have brought Boro, and this is the Boro Punty technique for working with other types of glass. I learned it from Amber Cowan, and she learned it from Lauren Stump, and it's very helpful technique. It's been around a while now, but what it does is allow you to have a larger handle. So if working with the metal mandrels, it can be really hard to have enough control when you work with a large material because that diameter is so small. Just like sizing up your pipe in the hot shot, size up your punchy on the torch when you're working with your recycled glass. And so I still bounce my Boro. I know I don't have to, but we're building good habits. And so we're going to, I have some preheated shards of glue inside the furnace. And so I'm going to pick one of those up, Laura, and I'll de-scum it for you. Turn this up a little bit because we're going to work with a larger chunk here.
In soft glass, the cobalt is always stiff. Is the cobalt stiffer than the grain?
Yeah, so in soft glass, the cobalt is always stiff. Is the cobalt stiffer in the bottle glass? It's actually a little softer. It's more similar to furnace glass than it is to flame glass. And so it's going to be a little bit softer. But what it does is that the cobalt in it crystallizes a little bit more than the iron does in the green glass. And so you get this devitrification, you get this scuzz across the surface that's super annoying. So I've just rounded out the tip of this Boro. I'm just going to flatten it down to a flat spot. Clear the space here for my second punchy. And then I'm just going to heat this up, and you can either pick it up in forceps out of the annealer, or you can directly hit it with the glass. It just depends on how thick that piece is. So we're going to peek in here. I think I'm going to pick it up with forceps and introduce it. But this is going to give me a lot of freedom to work with a much larger mass of the blue glass of the torch rather than with the amount you'd use for a bead. So when I'm making the larger leaves or botanical forms, or I'm starting to make some water drop shapes for an upcoming project, all these different things, I've started using this method to make sure that I can scale up to the size that I want. So I'm just going to seal that right on there. Hey, I wanted all of that. Luckily, there was a pile of glass there, and I didn't burn the table. Okay, so now I'm just going to round this out. So if I was going to pull cane, I would put a second punchy on the other side, do exactly what I did with the metal mandrels in order to do that, and then heat it up. This isn't actually too scuzzy of a blue. Let's turn up the flame and burn it. So we can... Come on, blue, burn for me for a second. Okay, so I've got a little scuzz on there, so something that you can do If you get the scuzz on the inside and you're making a solid piece, it doesn't matter that much. But if the scuzz is on the outside of your piece, then you're gonna notice it. I use a Carlisle very often. But yeah, so there I just boiled the edges of this by heating it up too fast, which I wanted to do. And so all I'm gonna do to skim this off the surface is I just take whichever size tweezers that are appropriate to the job. It's important to have a glass of water if you're gonna work small so you can keep quenching your thin tweezers so they don't stick. But I'm just actually gonna like peel off a tiny bit of that scuzz, and then the scuzz is no more. So when you peel that scuzz off the surface, it just means that when you then go to stretch it, it's not gonna have those scuzz or stretch marks later. What do you think? You can relax. Okay. One of the other things you can do is, if you need to ball this up faster, or if you're working production in your recycled glass and you want it to go really fast, you can use your Boro punty on the other side to speed up the gathering process. So again, just with the hand on the other side, just tack it, and then just like I spun it, you're gonna spin this glass, and then you can see how much faster having a second handle actually lets you ball that up, because you're not waiting for gravity, you're not messing around, you're just like, I would like to use this now. But one of the things you have to consider is that now you have Boro in this, and you cannot leave Boro in this. But because the Boro is so stiff, it is stiffer than our recycled glass. When you remove it, and you get it hot on that one side and you start to pull it away, you'll notice that the Boro pulls away all in one. So you almost let this cool a little bit and pull this away, and it's a little nodule, a little node of that flattened, and you can see the shadow of it in there. And then you can just melt it out, make sure you get it all out, and then just like you would take off the top of your Boro punty, you set that aside. If you accidentally leave a little Boro in there, which can happen, you'll see it as a small shadow or haze on your glass. Go in with your tweezers, rip that back out so that it's not gonna shatter the piece you just lovingly made, and then you should be fine. Leaves are my favorite shape, so we're going to go do that again if that's okay. One of the things you can also do is if you want to add your texture before you flatten your shapes, you can do that too. But you've got to use a more substantial tool, so like your larger tweezers, like these new ones I just got from Jason here. Very exciting. New gas tools. So that texture didn't stay perfectly on the surface there because I flattened that so hot. So I'll add a little bit more of it. But you'll also notice that as I flattened it that time, I pulled away from the Boro punty a little bit, constricting that down like a jackline, all ready to make sure it's going to be favorable. And you can see just how much it wants to move. You can use the Boro punty on the other side to remove it like you would if you were building something in Boro. I just prefer that because I find that I end up leaving a tiny shard on there and end up cracking the piece. So when I'm ready to pull this off, I just shrink my flame down a little and I just preheat the forceps and bring it down to a point. If you add a Boro punty on the other side, you can make loops. The loops are not as durable as Boro loops, so they need to be babied, but it is doable. The more time you spend working with it, the easier it'll get.
Do you ever use tungsten to pierce holes?
Do I ever use tungsten to pierce holes? I do occasionally. It works. It's actually pretty easy in recycled glass to pierce holes because it gets so hot so quickly that you just get right through there. You can get through in a couple of pierces. I have the fisheye tweezers as well back home, not on the table with me, but those for piercing holes through work really well with the recycled glass. And then it just goes right back in the kiln where it came back out of. And all right, so I brought some fun mandrels if you want to see. I brought one of the large half-inch hole mandrels, and I also brought, I don't know if anyone else has played with the button cap mandrels, so they're kind of bead caps. They look a little bit like a thimble, but with a hole through the top. And so if you're making tassel toppers, or if you're making things for ropes, they're really nice. But working with mandrels, and particularly with mandrels of another shape, because this glass gets so hot so quickly, it can be really easy to fuse it to your bead release, through your bead release to your mandrel. You might end up pulling on it too hard. You might end up breaking your bead release. And so always remember that it's recycled glass. If it breaks, we use it again. And so it's really easy to get that bead release back out of it when you need it to. So do you guys have any other questions for me while I'm looking through? Yeah.
Have you ever tumbled or etched or sandblasted the bead?
So have I ever tumbled or sandblasted or anything like that for my beads? I haven't yet, just because I don't have the access to the equipment, but I would love to try some of that. I wanted to tumble some beads to see if I could make sea glass beads, because of course most sea glass is bottle glass. And then one of the things I've started doing is that I travel a lot for work. My work as an environmental educator brings me on cruise ships all over the world. And one of the things that strikes me is that no matter where I go, on the ground somewhere there is broken glass. And because I've started using the broken glass in the torch, I now have a jar at home of little pieces that I've labeled in Sharpie of where they come from. And so I'm starting to look at the differences, and is there more or less of one kind of glass? What kind of glass is broken in places? Is it bottles? Is it windows? Is it wine glasses from something? And so it's really interesting to see that even though we're so far apart and so different, that we have these things in common, which is really fun. Even if the thing we have in common is glass waste, unfortunately. Ha! So, did not have the mandrel hot enough. See it? That's fun. Let's melt that on there, please. That's embarrassing. The trick with bottle glass is to both speed up and slow down. So as soon as the glass stops moving, slow down. Because if you pull at it, if you rush it, if you force it, it's going to either pop, crack, or you're going to break your bead release, you're going to break off your Boro punty, or something like that. But as soon as you have that glass hot, as soon as you've taken a bead and you've slowed down for that second, speed right back up to make sure that you have it going again. Because otherwise, you're going to miss your opportunity and you're going to have to wait again. It's a hurry up and wait. Hurry up and wait. As is most things in life. So this is fairly uneven, so I'm going to hit it with a marker just because it did that weird little pull away thing. One of the nice things is because it's a little bit colder, because it's a little bit slower heating up, you can often really set your shape and then leave it that way. So like there are gaps in this right now, and unlike soft glass that would fill in those gaps really quickly, if I wanted gaps, they'd be really easy to achieve. I have no idea what time it is. Anyone have the time? Do we have other places to go? Huh?
4:45.
4:45. Oh, okay. We're there. We did it. Thanks for sticking around.
Do you ever upload videos on YouTube or anything?
Do I upload videos on YouTube? I am I'm not an organized enough person, but I'm working on it. I've taken a lot of videos. I have not uploaded any of them. It's two different art forms. I hold so much respect for people who manage to document their process the whole way through, because I find even when I'm drawing or if I'm making a piece of glass, I have images of the beginning of the process, about a third of the way through, and then I have the finished piece, because I got really, really into it, and then it was over. So I don't do my glass full time right now. It's kind of half time when I'm home from being an environmental educator. And so it's become sort of the case that I make my money through public speaking, which was never the intention. And I know it's not everyone's favorite thing, but I've decided that talking about what we're passionate about is one of the most important things we can do as creators. Making our art is one language, being able to talk about our art is entirely another thing. So I'm going to use this moment while I'm wearing a microphone in front of my glassy family to say that practicing talking about your art, whether it's to family members, whether it's to small local clubs and organizations, whether it's the little videos we upload online, is really important, because the more often you articulate the art that you're making, the more often it will actually influence what it is you're making into being what you want it to be, why you're making it. We don't always know why we're making something when we're making it. Sometimes that articulation comes in hindsight, in a series or in a body of work, you see how things fit together. But the more often we talk about why things are important, how they matter, and how they can improve, those improvements actually happen. And so whenever you're speaking in public, the most important thing is to be comfortable. My favorite thing are bad puns. When I start my whale talks out at sea, all of them start with, "Whale, hello there." And it took all of me today not to start out that way here. And then, of course, you can start out however you want, but always have a final line or a final closeout that signifies we are done. Because if you don't have those, things tend to peter out. They sort of wind down, and it leaves room for interpretation where you might not have meant it. And so if you end on a rhyme, it's convincing all the time. Thank you. I'm not signifying we're done. We're just but I'm actually, this fall, if anyone's interested or might be around, I'm going to be teaching a weekend workshop at the Corning Museum of Glass. I'm going to be teaching public speaking for artists. And the goal is to have everyone leave with a 15 to 20-minute talk on either their artistic practice or a specific body of work. And so it's all the tips and tricks and trade of, if something has gone wrong in public speaking events, it has happened to me at one point or another. I've given thousands of shows at this point, whether on wildlife or glass history. You don't know it, but I talk about all of you while I'm out at sea. I weave my glass art into everything, our community, and spreading it as much as I can. Excuse me, good. So that's really fun. I'm trying to call this one good. It's a little odd, but we're done looking at that. So we have hit the end of our time. I don't know if you would like to see anything else. Is there anything I haven't addressed? All,
that was great.
All good? All right. Well, then I'll leave you.